Hi, Harvest. As we approach the end of the year, as if you read any sort of Christian blogs, you'll find there's a tendency to give sort of favorite books from the year as we approach gift giving season with Christmas. And I always enjoy looking at those lists and finding more excuses to spend money on books. And so I want to share with you my top 5 books from this year in hopes that it will inspire some of your reading decisions in the coming months. So in descending order, the first book that I want to share with you is one I'm actually not finished yet, but it's Bavinck, A Critical Biography by James Eglinton, a professor at the University of Edinburgh. And it's a new biography on Herman Bavinck that just came out this past year. Bavinck is a theologian whose writing I've really benefited from for all its warmth and biblical richness. And so I've appreciated him and learned a lot from him. And looking at his life, he lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the Netherlands, has been profitable, and looking at how did he navigate being a Christian and a theologian in an increasingly modernized world. And it's also interesting to look at some of the roots in the Dutch Reformed Church, which have intersection with my own family. Next, this book, it's not the prettiest cover of the collection, but The Crook in the Lot by Thomas Boston. The subtitle is The Sovereignty and Wisdom of God Displayed in the Afflictions of Men. And this is a book in which Boston, a Scottish pastor, looks at God's purposes in suffering and hardship. And this book, like so many books that leave an impact on my life, was the Lord just used it at a particular time as lockdowns were starting, and it encouraged me as I thought of what's God's purposes in these hardships. And Boston's chapter on the duty of humility and humbling ourselves under God's difficult providences was particularly challenging and helpful for me. But this is a classic and well worth your time. The Vine Project by Tony Payne and Colin Marshall. These are two Australian church workers, pastors, and this is a sequel to their book, The Trellis and the Vine, which looks at the topic of discipleship and Christian growth. And this book is looking at what does it mean to be a disciple? How does God make disciples? Where does he make disciples? But then it lays out a sort of strategic pathway of how do we better align our ministries in the church so that we're making disciples of Christ. And so I thought it was very helpful, and it's a book that you kind of need to spend a lot of time with as they give practical suggestions for how you can think about church ministry. So very, very good. And then this is That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. It's the third book in Lewis's space trilogy, in which he follows his character Elwyn Ransom to different planets. This one takes place on planet Earth, and it was my favorite of the three. And Lewis is just so good at writing about the nature of sin and temptation and the fall of man. And in this book, he tracks two characters in particular, Mark and Jane Studdock, and looks at the different ways that they intersect with evil. And Lewis also looks at God's redemption on a more cosmic level, and then he also, through the story, looks at personal redemption. And I just thought it was a very timely and prophetic book in a number of senses. And then my favorite book from this past year, it's one I've shared with a number of you, Gentle and Lowly, The Heart of Christ for Sinners and Sufferers by Dane Ortland. It gets bonus points for having the prettiest cover, a great texture, I love that. And this book, Ortland looks not specifically at the works of Christ, but at the heart of Christ. And in short, easy to read chapters, he looks at various scriptures and says, just lays out in wonderful ways, what's Christ's heart for me and for you in the gospel? And again, this was a very timely read for me. I read it in April, and the Lord used that just to bring refreshment when I was feeling spiritually dry and sort of languishing. And it was one, I could only read a chapter at a time because I just needed to sort of sit in the beauty of these reflections on Christ and his heart. So I'd encourage you to check out some of these books and read them for yourself or pick them up for a loved one. I think you would greatly enjoy them.